In the year 330 before Christ, the world ended. Not for everyone, but for the Persians, it was the apocalypse. The city was called Persepolis, the gate of all nations, the jewel of the ancient world. For 200 years, it had stood untouchable, sacred, the heart of an empire that ruled from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India. Persepolis was not just a city, it was a statement. Its palaces gleamed with gold, stripped from 23 conquered nations. Its walls held the tribute of kings. Its columns, 70 feet tall, were carved from single blocks of stone. Travelers said you could see it from 50 miles away, shining in the desert sun like a second sunrise. And then, in May of 330 BCE, a 26-year-old Macedonian king named Alexander gave an order.
Burn it. Burn it all.
For 3 days and 3 nights, Persepolis burned. Witnesses said the smoke could be seen 100 miles away. The heat was so intense that stone cracked, gold melted and ran through the streets like water. The great columns, the ones that had stood for 2 centuries, collapsed one by one, crashing down like dying gods. The Persians who watched believed it was the end of the world. And in a way, they were right. But this was not the beginning. To understand how the greatest empire on earth could fall in just 6 years, we need to go back to when Persia stood unrivaled, back to when the very idea of defeating it seemed impossible. 6 years earlier, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, and perhaps the greatest. Imagine this. From the Indus River in the east to the Nile River in the west, from the Danube in the north to the Arabian Sea in the south, 2.1 million square miles. That's larger than the continental United States. But size alone doesn't tell the story. In the year 330 BCE, the world's population was roughly 110 million people. 50 million of them, nearly half of all humanity, lived under Persian rule. If you were alive in 330 BCE, you probably bowed to the Persian king. The empire was divided into 20 satrapies, what we would call provinces, each one ruled by a governor who answered directly to the king of kings in the capital cities of Susa, Babylon, and Persepolis. These weren't just conquered territories, they were organized, administered, connected. The Persians built the Royal Road, 1,677 miles of ancient highway stretching from Sardis on the Mediterranean coast all the way to Susa in the heart of Persia. You could ride from one end of the empire to the other in 90 days. Postal stations were set up every 15 miles. Persian messengers rode day and night. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Sound familiar? The United States Postal Service borrowed that line from the Persians. Every year, representatives from 23 nations climbed the great stairway of Persepolis to present tribute to the King of Kings. Babylonians brought gold, Egyptians brought linen, Indians brought ivory and spices, the Scythians brought horses, the Greeks, yes, the Greeks, brought silver and wine. You can still see them today, carved into the stone walls of Persepolis, an eternal procession, a snapshot of the ancient world, frozen in time. The Persian Empire wasn't just powerful, it was diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and, for its time, remarkably tolerant. Jews, Zoroastrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, they all lived under Persian rule. And unlike most ancient empires, the Persians didn't force their subjects to abandon their gods or their customs. This was the superpower of the ancient world. And in 334 BCE, a 22-year-old boy king from a backwater kingdom called Macedon decided he was going to destroy it. To understand what Alexander was facing, you need to understand the dynasty he was challenging. The Achaemenids, the family that had ruled the known world for over 200 years. It began with a man named Cyrus the Great. In 559 BCE, Cyrus inherited a small kingdom in what is now southern Iran. Within 30 years, he had conquered the Medes, the Lydians, and, most spectacularly, Babylon. Babylon, the greatest city in the world. Unconquerable. Cyrus took it without a battle. He diverted the Euphrates River, marched his troops through the riverbed under the city walls, and took Babylon in a single night. But here's what made Cyrus different. When he entered the city, he didn't burn it. He didn't slaughter the population. He didn't tear down their temples. Instead, he freed the Jews who had been held captive there for 50 years. He let them return to Jerusalem. He even paid to rebuild their temple. The Jewish prophet Isaiah called him the Anointed One. A pagan king, honored in the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus created a model. Conquer, yes, but rule with tolerance. Let people keep their gods, their languages, their customs. Just pay your taxes and bow to the King of Kings. It worked. For 2 centuries, it worked. After Cyrus came his son, Cambyses, who conquered Egypt. Then came Darius I, Darius the Great, who organized the empire, built Persepolis, and created the satrap system that would hold the empire together. Darius also invaded Greece. The year was 490 BCE. The battle was Marathon. The Persians lost. It was the first crack, a tiny one, but a crack nonetheless. Darius's son, Xerxes, tried again. In 480 BCE, he assembled the largest army the world had ever seen. Ancient sources claimed 2.5 million men and marched on Greece. You know the story. Thermopylae, 300 Spartans, the hot gates. The Spartans died, but they bought time. Xerxes burned Athens. He thought he had won. Then came Salamis, a naval battle in a narrow strait. The Persians had 1,200 ships. The Greeks had 370. The Greeks won. Xerxes went home. The Greeks celebrated. And for the next 150 years, Persia left Greece alone. But the empire endured. It adapted. It thrived. Until it didn't. By 340 BCE, the empire was fraying. Egypt, jewel of the south, revolted again. For the 4th time in a century, the Persians reconquered it again. But each time, it took more gold, more soldiers, more effort. The satraps in the west, governors of provinces like Lydia and Phrygia, were acting less like administrators and more like kings. They minted their own coins, raised their own armies. Some stopped sending tribute to the capital. Between 372 and 362 BCE, half the empire erupted in what historians call the Great Satraps' Revolt. It nearly tore Persia apart. And then there were the Greeks. Tens of thousands of Greek hoplites, heavy infantry soldiers, were fighting as mercenaries for Persian gold. The empire's best infantry weren't even Persian. They were foreigners, hired swords. The throne itself was cursed. Nearly every Persian king for a century had died by assassination, poisoned by a rival, stabbed by a eunuch, murdered by a son. Power didn't pass from father to son anymore. It passed to whoever could kill fast enough. The empire was vast, wealthy, powerful, but it was also fragile. And in 338 BCE, that fragility turned into catastrophe. The year is 338 before Christ. The royal palace at Susa, a man named Bagoas, a eunuch, an advisor, a kingmaker, pours poison into a cup of wine. The king, Artaxerxes III, drinks. Within hours, he's dead. Bagoas places the king's son, Artaxerxes IV, on the throne. The boy is 20 years old. Bagoas controls him completely. For 2 years, the empire is ruled by a eunuch, pulling the strings of a puppet king. And then Bagoas poisons him too. But Bagoas isn't done. He knows that any surviving member of the royal family could challenge his power, so he orders a purge. 80 princes and princesses of the Achaemenid dynasty are hunted down and murdered. Some are poisoned, some are stabbed, some, according to ancient accounts, are buried alive. The oldest ruling family in the world nearly wiped out in a matter of weeks. Only a few distant cousins survive. One of them is a man named Darius III. He's a satrap, a governor of a distant province called Armenia. He's competent, dignified, but he's not a warrior. He's not a conqueror. He's an administrator. Bagoas chooses him for exactly that reason. Bow to me, Bagoas tells him, and you can be king. Darius bows, he takes the throne. He becomes Darius III, King of Kings, ruler of the Persian Empire. And then, quietly, carefully, he poisons Bagoas. Darius III is now the undisputed ruler of the greatest empire on earth, but the throne he inherits is soaked in blood. The royal family is gone. The satraps are restless. Egypt is on the verge of revolt again. And from the west comes news. 334 before Christ, the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water that separates Europe from Asia. The Greeks called it the gateway to the east. Alexander stood on the deck of the lead ship, watching the Asian shore grow closer. Behind him, 40,000 men, Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, Illyrians, crowded onto transport vessels, an invasion force, small by Persian standards, but disciplined, battle-hardened, ready. As the ship neared the shore, Alexander did something strange. He took his spear, the same spear his father Philip had carried, and hurled it into the Asian beach.
I claim Asia as my prize won by the spear.
It was more than theater. It was a declaration. Alexander wasn't coming to negotiate. He wasn't coming to raid and retreat. He was coming to conquer the entire continent. After landing, Alexander made a pilgrimage north to the ruins of Troy, the city where, according to legend, the Greek hero Achilles had fought and died 1,000 years before. Alexander believed Achilles was his ancestor. He slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow. He saw himself not just as a king, but as a hero from myth. At Achilles' tomb, Alexander laid a wreath. He stripped naked and ran around the burial mound, an ancient Greek custom. He was honoring the dead and sending a message to the living.
I am the new Achilles. and I have come to finish what he started.
Meanwhile, 20 miles to the east, Persian satraps were gathering their forces at a river called the Granicus. They had 20,000 men, cavalry mostly, the best horsemen in the world. They thought it would be enough. It wasn't. The Granicus River, May 334 EBCE. Late afternoon, Alexander's army approached from the west. Across the river, on the high ground, the Persian cavalry waited. Behind them, 30,000 Greek mercenaries, hoplites in full armor, stood in formation. The river wasn't wide, but it was deep, and the far bank was steep. Muddy, difficult ground. Alexander's general, Parmenion, a 60-year-old veteran who had served Alexander's father, rode up beside him. "My king," he said, "it's late in the day. The men are tired. The river is difficult. Let's camp here tonight and attack at dawn when we have the advantage." Alexander looked at the river, at the Persians waiting on the far side.
No, we've come too far to wait. We attack now.
Parmenion tried again.
The Persians hold the high ground. They'll slaughter us as we climb out of the water.
Alexander turned to face him.
If we wait, we show fear, and I will not fear Persians.
The companion cavalry, Alexander's elite horsemen, plunged into the river. Alexander led them personally. He always led from the front. The crossing was chaos. Horses lost footing in the current. Men struggled to keep their shields up as water poured over them. The steep bank on the far side slowed them down, and the Persians were waiting. Arrows rained down. Persian cavalry charged into the water, meeting the Macedonians halfway. It became a brutal hand-to-hand melee. Swords, spears, horses screaming. Alexander fought in the thick of it. His white-plumed helmet made him an obvious target. A Persian noble named Spithridates rode directly at him, swinging a curved sword. The blade struck Alexander's helmet, cracked it, dented it. Alexander's vision blurred. Spithridates raised his sword for a killing blow. And then a Macedonian officer named Clytus the Black rode in from the side and cut Spithridates down with a single stroke. Alexander survived, barely. The Persian cavalry, seeing their commanders falling, began to break. They fled east, abandoned the field, left the Greek mercenaries, the hoplites standing alone. The Greeks requested terms, honorable surrender. They were professionals. They'd been hired to fight. The fight was over. Alexander refused.
You are Greeks fighting against Greeks. That is treason.
He ordered the Macedonian phalanx forward. 18-foot spears, tight formation, unstoppable. The hoplites tried to fight, but they were surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted. By sunset, 2,000 Greek mercenaries lay dead. Another 2,000 were captured and sent to labor camps in Macedon. Alexander's losses, fewer than 100 men. The Battle of Granicus was over, Alexander's first victory on Asian soil. But it was more than a battle. It was a statement. The Persians weren't invincible, and Alexander was just getting started. Summer and fall, 334 before Christ, Alexander marched south and east through Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. City after city opened its gates. Sardis, the old Lydian capital, surrendered without a fight. Ephesus welcomed him as a liberator. The Persian satraps fled, their armies melted away. the western provinces of the empire, Lydia, Caria, Lycia, Pamphylia, fell into Alexander's hands in a matter of months. The Persians had ruled these lands for 200 years. Alexander took them in 6. In the city of Gordium, Alexander encountered a legend, the Gordian knot, an ancient knot of rope tied centuries before, securing an ox cart to a post. The prophecy said,
"Whoever unties the Gordian knot will rule all of Asia."
Dozens of men had tried. Kings, scholars, priests, no one could untie it. Alexander studied the knot, pulled at it, tried to find the ends of the rope. Then he stopped. He drew his sword and cut the knot in half.
I will rule Asia, but I will do it my way.
By autumn, Alexander had reached the Mediterranean coast, the city of Tarsus. He nearly died there, not from battle, but from fever. He plunged into a cold river after a long march and collapsed. His doctors said he wouldn't survive, but Alexander recovered, slowly, stubbornly. And while he recovered, news arrived from the east. Darius was coming, the King of Kings himself, leading the full might of the Persian Empire. 100,000 men, maybe more. This wouldn't be a skirmish with a regional army. This would be war. Babylon. Fall 334 before Christ, Darius III stood in the throne room of the ancient city. Around him, satraps and generals from every corner of the empire knelt. He had called them to war. From Bactria came cavalry, horsemen from the steppes, descendants of Scythian nomads. From India came war elephants, towering beasts that had never seen a Greek soldier. From the mountains of Media came archers, men who could shoot a bow from horseback at full gallop. And from the heartland of Persia came the Immortals. The Immortals, 10,000 elite warriors, so named because their number never changed. If one fell in battle, another immediately took his place. They wore scale armor, carried spears and short swords, and they had never been defeated in open battle. Darius also hired Greek mercenaries, 30,000 hoplites, professional soldiers who fought for gold, not glory. Ancient historians claim Darius assembled 600,000 men. Modern scholars say it was closer to 100,000. His plan was simple. March to the Mediterranean coast, find Alexander, crush him with overwhelming numbers. Darius wasn't worried. How could he be? Alexander had 40,000 men. Darius had 100,000. But numbers don't win wars, tactics do. And Alexander was a master. November 333 before Christ, the coastal plain near the town of Issus, in what is now southern Turkey. Alexander was marching south along the Mediterranean coast, heading toward the great Phoenician cities Tyre, Sidon, Damascus. He thought Darius was still far to the east. He was wrong. Darius had taken a gamble. Instead of meeting Alexander in the open plains where his superior numbers would dominate, he marched north along a parallel route through the mountains. And he got ahead of Alexander. When Alexander's scouts reported that a Persian army was behind him, cutting off his supply lines, Alexander didn't believe it at first.
Darius came north into the narrow coastal pass.
It didn't make sense. In a narrow pass, Darius couldn't use his numerical advantage. His cavalry would be cramped, his elephants useless. Unless Darius was trying to force a battle on ground that neutralized Alexander's tactical genius, or unless Darius had made a terrible mistake. Alexander turned his army around, marched back north, and at dawn, on a cold November morning, the two armies met. On one side, Darius III, King of Kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, commanding 100,000 troops. On the other, Alexander of Macedon, 23 years old, commanding 40,000. The battlefield was a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other. A small river, the Pinarus, ran between the two armies. Darius positioned his Greek mercenaries in the center, his best infantry, 30,000 men in tight formation. On the flanks, he placed his Persian cavalry, and behind them, archers, thousands of them. Darius himself stood in the center on a raised chariot surrounded by the immortals. Alexander studied the Persian line, and he smiled. Darius had made the mistake Alexander hoped for. By choosing this narrow ground, Darius had neutralized his own advantage. His 100,000 men couldn't all fit on the battlefield at once. Thousands were crammed in the rear, unable to fight. And Darius, standing in the center, visible on his golden chariot, had made himself a target. Alexander gave the order.
We charge the center, straight at Darius. Break through, kill the king.
His officers stared at him.
My king, the center is where their best troops are. The Greeks, the immortals.
Alexander nodded.
I know, that's where Darius is. And when Darius falls, the battle is over.
The companion cavalry, 2,000 horsemen, formed a wedge, Alexander at the tip, and they charged. Straight at the heart of the Persian Empire, the companion cavalry crashed into the Persian left flank like a battering ram. Alexander led from the front. He always did. His white-plumed helmet made him visible to every man on the battlefield, his own troops and the enemy. The Persian cavalry tried to meet the charge, but Alexander's wedge formation was unstoppable. It punched through their line, scattering horsemen in every direction. On the other side of the battlefield, the Macedonian left flank was collapsing. Persian cavalry had crossed the river and were driving the Macedonian infantry back toward the sea. Men were dying. The line was breaking. But Alexander didn't stop. He didn't turn to help his left flank. He drove straight forward toward the center, toward Darius. The Greek mercenaries, 30,000 hoplites fighting for Persian gold, saw him coming. They braced, locked shields, lowered spears. The immortals, 10,000 of Persia's finest, moved forward to protect their king. And then Alexander did something insane. He didn't slow down. The companion cavalry slammed into the Greek hoplites at full speed. Horses reared, men fell. The Greeks held their ground. Barely, but the sheer force of the impact created chaos. And in that chaos, Alexander saw his opening. A gap between the Greek mercenaries and the immortals, just wide enough. He spurred his horse forward. Darius saw him coming, the Macedonian king, covered in blood, some his own, most not, charging directly at the King of Kings, 50 yards away, 40, 30. Darius's bodyguards surged forward. The immortals threw themselves between Alexander and their king. Men died trying to stop him, but Alexander kept coming. 20 yards, 10. And then Darius did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. he ran. His chariot driver, seeing Alexander bearing down on them, didn't wait for orders. He whipped the horses and turned the chariot east, away from the battle. Darius, king of kings, ruler of 50 million people, fled the battlefield. The moment the Persian army saw their king's chariot retreating, everything collapsed. The immortals stopped fighting and turned to follow Darius. The cavalry on the flanks, who had been winning, saw the chaos in the center and panicked. The Greek mercenaries, abandoned by their employers, tried to retreat in formation. What had been a battle became a massacre. The Macedonians pursued, cut down fleeing Persians by the thousands. The riverbanks ran red, bodies piled so high that later waves of fleeing soldiers had to climb over their own dead. Ancient sources claim 50,000 Persians died that day. Modern historians think it was closer to 20,000. Either way, it was a catastrophe. Alexander's losses, fewer than 500 men. The King of Kings had commanded 100,000 soldiers, and he'd lost to a 23-year-old boy king from Macedon. But the worst part, for Darius, wasn't the battle. It was what Alexander found in the Persian camp. After the battle, Alexander's troops swept through the Persian camp. They found treasure, mountains of gold and silver, Darius's personal tent, more luxurious than any palace Alexander had ever seen. Persian carpets, silk curtains, a bathtub carved from a single piece of marble. And they found Darius's family. Darius's mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statera, one of the most beautiful women in the ancient world, his 2 daughters, his young son. They'd been traveling with the army, following behind the battle, waiting for news of victory. Instead, they became prisoners. When Alexander entered the tent, the women fell to their knees. They begged for their lives. Sisygambis, Darius's mother, was 70 years old. She prostrated herself before this blood-covered foreign king. Alexander stopped her.
Stand. You are the mother of the King of Kings. You bow to no one.
He ordered his men to leave the tent. Then he spoke to Sisygambis directly.
You will not be harmed. You will not be ransomed. You will be treated as royalty. This I swear.
And he kept his word. For the rest of his life, Alexander treated Darius's family with honor. Sisygambis was given her own household. Darius's wife and daughters were guarded, protected, respected. His son was educated alongside Macedonian princes. Ancient historians say Sisygambis came to love Alexander more than her own son. When news of the capture reached Darius, who had fled 200 miles east before stopping, he wept, not just from shame, but from fear. If Alexander harmed his family, there would be nothing Darius wouldn't do for revenge. But Alexander didn't harm them. And that, perhaps more than any battlefield victory, broke something inside Darius, because it meant Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a king who understood mercy, and that made him dangerous in a way Darius hadn't anticipated. Winter 333 before Christ, Darius sent envoys to Alexander. They carried a letter sealed with the royal seal of Persia. It was a peace offer. The terms were generous, extraordinary even. Darius offered Alexander everything west of the Euphrates River, all of Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Phoenicia, half the Persian Empire. He offered 10,000 talents of gold, enough to make Alexander the richest king in the world. and he offered his daughter's hand in marriage, an alliance between Macedon and Persia, a partnership. All Alexander had to do was stop, turn back, accept that he had won as much as any man could reasonably win. Alexander read the letter in front of his generals. Parmenion, the old, cautious general who had served Alexander's father, spoke first.
My king, if I were Alexander, I would accept these terms.
Alexander looked at him.
So would I if I were Parmenion.
He turned to the Persian envoys.
Tell Darius that the earth cannot have two sons. Asia cannot have two kings. If he wants peace, he must come to me, kneel, and surrender the entire empire. If he refuses, I will come to him.
The envoys returned to Darius with Alexander's response. There would be no peace. There would only be war, total war, until one of them was dead or broken. Darius realized then what he was facing. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a rebellion. This wasn't a war that could be negotiated. This was conquest, and Alexander wouldn't stop until he held every inch of Persian soil. Darius began preparing for the final battle, but first, Alexander had unfinished business in the west. 332 before Christ, the island city of Tyre. Tyre was one of the great Phoenician cities built on an island half a mile offshore, protected by massive walls, 60 feet high. It had never been taken by force, not in 1,000 years. When Alexander demanded Tyre's surrender, the city fathers laughed.
You have no navy. How will you reach us?
Alexander's response was simple.
Then I will build a road.
For 7 months, Alexander's engineers constructed a causeway, a stone and earth bridge stretching from the mainland to the island, half a mile long, wide enough for siege towers. The Tyrians attacked the construction crews, set fire to the wooden scaffolding, dropped stones from their walls. Men died. Progress was slow. But Alexander didn't stop. Stone by stone, yard by yard, month after month, the causeway grew. When the causeway finally reached the walls, Alexander brought up siege towers, the tallest ever built, 150 feet high. The Tyrians fought with everything they had, poured boiling sand on the attackers, launched heated metal onto the siege towers. But in July of 332 BCE, the walls were breached. When Alexander's troops entered the city, they were furious. 7 months of siege, thousands of their comrades dead. They wanted blood. Alexander tried to restrain them, but the rage was too great. 6,000 Tyrian men of fighting age were killed. 30,000 civilians were sold into slavery. The city that had stood for 1,000 years was erased. The siege of Tyre taught the ancient world a lesson. Alexander would not be stopped by walls. He would not be stopped by the sea. He would not be stopped by time. If you resisted, you died. If you surrendered, you lived. Every city from Tyre to Egypt heard that message, and when Alexander marched south, they opened their gates. November 332 before Christ, Alexander crossed into Egypt. The Egyptians hated the Persians. For 200 years, Persia had occupied Egypt, suppressed Egyptian religion, taxed them into poverty, crushed revolts with brutal force. When Alexander arrived, the Egyptian priests welcomed him as a liberator. They crowned him Pharaoh, not just king, Pharaoh, son of Ra, the sun god. divine ruler of the two lands. Alexander traveled to the Siwa oasis in the western desert. There, in a temple built 500 years before, lived the Oracle of Ammon, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. Alexander went alone into the inner chamber, spoke to the oracle in private. What they discussed, no one knows. But when Alexander emerged, he was changed. He told his generals that the oracle had confirmed what he had always suspected. He was not the son of Philip. He was the son of Zeus, a god. Some of his generals rolled their eyes. Political theater, they thought, a way to legitimize his rule in Egypt. But others weren't so sure, because Alexander believed him. In early 331 before Christ, Alexander founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast. He designed it himself, walked the perimeter, marking where the walls would go with barley flour. He called it Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse, a center of learning that would last 1,000 years. But Alexander didn't stay to see it built, because word had reached him from the east. Darius was assembling another army, bigger than before, stronger than before, and this time Darius was choosing the battlefield. A vast, flat plain in Mesopotamia, perfect for cavalry, perfect for chariots, perfect for the massive Persian army. The plain was called Gaugamela, and there Darius would make his final stand, because he knew, and Alexander knew, that this would be the battle that decided everything. The future of the world would be settled on a single day, in a single place, Gaugamela.